This recording is the first part of two for the respiratory system. The respiratory system functions for the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide and helps us maintain acid-base balance throughout the body. Some of the secondary functions for the respiratory system include sensing different odors as well as producing speech. When it comes to the respiratory system, there are two main zones, the first being the conducting zone, which is the pathway for incoming and outgoing air. This is where we can also remove pathogens and warm and moisten the air that is coming into the body. There's also a respiratory zone that's directly involved with the exchange of gas, and that begins where special tiny little branches of the airways called terminal bronchioles join the respiratory bronchioles. If we look at the beginning of the respiratory system, we find that it commences with the nose, and you'll remember from AMP1 that there are nasal conchae. There's a superior and middle nasal conchae, which are part of the ethmoid bone, and then on either side we have inferior nasal conchae, which are separate individual bones. And the conchae allow for air to swirl around, and that helps to clean the incoming air, and those meatuses or canals that are formed by the conchae help to warm and moisten the air. Now, you'll remember that the respiratory epithelium consists mainly of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium that has goblet cells embedded within. These cells also produce lysozyme, which is a type of enzyme that can help destroy bacteria and other pathogens. These cells also produce protein defensins, which can destroy bacteria and other pathogens. And so we have cells that have an immune function within the respiratory system. And if you've ever wondered why cold air causes a runny nose, well, when there's cold air entering the nasal cavity, that stimulates goblet cells to produce more mucus to help moisten and warm that incoming air. After air passes through the nasal cavity, it's going to enter the pharynx. And the pharynx consists of three distinct areas. There's a nasopharynx, an oropharynx, and a laryngopharynx. And the nasopharynx is basically just an airway. It's a passage for air. The pharyngeal tonsils or adenoids are found in the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is closed off by the uvula. That's that little flap of mucus connective tissue membrane that hangs down off of the soft palate. So every time we swallow, the nasopharynx is closed off by the uvula. And the opening for the auditory tubes, you remember that there's an auditory tube, which is also known as the eustachian tube, which is also known as the pharyngotympanic tube, goes from the middle ear down into the nasopharynx, and there's a little flap that closes off that opening, and that's that popping sound that people hear when they go up in altitude. They have to equalize the pressure in the middle ear between the middle ear and the tympanic membrane and the external ear. So that popping sound is basically the flap closing. The oropharynx is a passage for air and for food, and that portion of the pharynx is made up of stratified squamous epithelium, and we find the palatine as well as the lingual tonsils in this area of the pharynx, in the oropharynx. Remember that the lingual tonsils are actually on the posterior aspect of the tongue. Then finally we have the laryngopharynx, which is a pathway for ingested material as well as for air, and this ends where the respiratory and digestive systems split into two different pathways. So the respiratory system is going to continue down the trachea, which is that main tube for air, and then the esophagus is the continuation for the digestive system. The respiratory system continues with the larynx, which is still part of that conducting zone, and the larynx is made up of cartilage that helps connect the pharynx to the major airway, which is the trachea, and it regulates the volume of air entering. The larynx is made up of thyroid cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage, and there's a prominence that sticks out anteriorly on the thyroid cartilage known as the laryngeal prominence. Also involved in the larynx is the opening called the glottis, and if you look at this lower picture on the left-hand side, you'll see the opening to the trachea, and the opening itself is known as the glottis. Now there is a special flap which you can see on the lower picture on the right, as well as the upper picture on the right. That is the epiglottis. The epiglottis is elastic cartilage that's covered by mucous membrane, and the epiglottis will close over the opening when we swallow solids or liquids. And there are also folds of membranes known as vestibular folds. A vestibule is a doorway. And then we have true vocal cords, which when air passes by the true vocal cords, that causes them to vibrate, producing sound. And there's also a large piece of cartilage just inferior to the thyroid cartilage, and that is called the cricoid cartilage. You can see that easily on the upper picture on the right-hand side, and it's also labeled on the right-hand side where we can see the cricoid cartilage. As the trachea continues inferiorly, understand that it is made up of hyaline cartilage C-shaped rings that help to keep it open, provide support, and there's also a fibroelastic membrane made up of the trachealis muscle and elastic connective tissue, which provides support and flexibility because the esophagus runs posterior to the trachea. Every time we swallow food particles or liquids, the esophagus has to be able to expand, and that fibroelastic membrane allows for that expansion of the esophagus. The trachea is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which, together with goblet cells that produce mucus, the cilia can sweep mucus upward towards the throat so that pathogens and bacteria can be swallowed and broken down by the gastric juice. There is a special piece of cartilage at the inferiormost aspect of the trachea known as the carina, and the carina is where the trachea splits into the bronchial tree. Now the bronchial tree has complete rings of hyaline cartilage. There is a right and left primary bronchus, and that will divide into secondary bronchi and tertiary bronchi. The bronchial tree is also lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium and goblet cells, and the terminal branches of the tertiary bronchi are going to turn into what are known as bronchioles, and the bronchioles are completely muscular. They're smooth muscle, there's no cartilage involved. The respiratory zone begins where terminal bronchioles join respiratory bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles are going to split into alveolar ducts to which alveoli, small thin sacs, are connected. Not only are the alveoli connected to the alveolar ducts, they're also connected to one another through tiny little openings known as alveolar pores. And the alveoli are mostly made up of type 1 cells, which is just simple squamous epithelium. It makes up about 90% of the alveolar sac. And then there are also type 2 cells, the remaining 10% of the alveolus, which produce surfactant. And surfactant is a liquid that has a mixture of lipids and proteins that decrease the surface tension between air and the fluid in the alveoli, preventing them from collapsing during exhalation. You'll notice that there are also macrophages located in the alveoli, and those are immune cells, obviously, that are going to help eat up bacteria and other pathogens. And the connection between the capillaries that surround the alveoli is what is known as the respiratory membrane. Here we have another visual representation of the bronchial tree. Asthma is a type of respiratory disorder that causes inflammation and edema of airways, where the smooth muscle surrounding bronchioles can constrict. That causes excessive secretion of mucus. It causes coughing, shortness of breath, wheezing, tightness in the chest, and is often managed with inhalers of corticosteroids that decrease the inflammation. When we look at the gross anatomy of the lungs, we can see that they are made up of a large, highly permeable epithelial surface area that is connected to the trachea by the bronchi. And where the bronchi enter the lungs is also an indented area of the lungs where blood vessels and nerves will enter. That's referred to as the hilum of the lung, where that indentation is. The lungs are bordered inferiorly by the diaphragm, which you can't see on this picture, and they are enclosed by serous membranes, collectively known as pleurae. Remember that the serous membrane on the surface of the lung is the visceral pleura, and the membrane that folds back on itself to line the wall of the pleural cavity is the parietal pleura. The lungs consist of lobes. On the individual's right lung, we see 3 lobes, the superior, middle, and inferior lobe, that are separated by fissures. On the left side of this person's body, we have 2 lobes, a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. You can also see on the left lung there is an indentation known as the cardiac notch because the heart lies slightly to the left. The lobes are further broken down into segments, and there are roughly 10 segments on the right side, 8 to 10 on the left, and those bronchopulmonary segments make up the 3 lobes, and the bronchopulmonary segments are served by the tertiary bronchi and arteries. The segments are further broken down into lobules, and those are the smallest segments within the lobe that are visual, or within the segment, that are visual with the naked eye. They're pieces of connective tissue that separate the lobules, and those are known as interlobar segments. I'm sorry, interlobar septa, because the word septa means wall. When we look at the blood supply for the lungs, we have pulmonary arteries that come from the pulmonary trunk off of the right ventricle of the heart, and those pulmonary arteries will carry deoxygenated blood as the arteries branch into smaller blood vessels, arterioles, and finally capillaries, where they turn into a pulmonary capillary network. And the capillary walls plus the alveolar walls are what make up, again, what's known as the respiratory membrane. And if we look on this picture on the far right of this slide, you can see the respiratory membrane here. And so there's the endothelium of the capillary wall and the type 1 alveolar cell of the alveolus, and then there's a thin non-living basal lamina between those two. So the respiratory membrane is very thin. It's only a half to 1 micrometer thick, and gas exchange can occur as oxygenated blood will leave the lungs and go back to the heart by way of the pulmonary veins. When it comes to the innervation of the lungs, the parasympathetic nervous system can cause bronchoconstriction because we don't need a lot of air to come into the lungs if we're relaxed. The sympathetic nervous system, conversely, will cause bronchodilation because if a bear walks into the room, you need to have a lot of air flowing into your lungs so it can run away from the bear or fight the bear. The autonomic nervous system also regulates coughing and chemical levels. And you'll notice there's a pulmonary plexus. Remember, the word plexus just means network. So we've got a pulmonary plexus, a network of nerves that goes to the lungs, the entrance of which is at that indented area of the lung referred to as the hilum. That's also where blood vessels will enter. The nerves will follow the bronchi, and they'll also branch to innervate muscle fibers, glands, and vessels. Now, I mentioned previously that there are serous membranes that surround the lung. We have the visceral pleura on the surface of the lung. That connective tissue will also extend into the fissures that separate the lobes. There's a parietal layer, which is the outer layer that connects the lungs to the pleural cavity within the thoracic cavity. And then inferior to the parietal layer, we see the diaphragm. And remember that the heart, the trachea, the thymus, and the esophagus are all located in the area known as the mediastinum. The function of the pleural membranes, as with any serous membrane, is to produce serous fluid that helps to reduce friction when these organs move. It also helps in terms of maintaining position of the organ because it provides surface tension. The movement of air into and out of the lungs is what we call pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation can occur because when we inhale, the diaphragm moves inferiorly. That increases the volume inside the thoracic cavity in the lungs. When we increase volume, we decrease pressure. That's known as Boyle's law. You can see in the picture on the left-hand side that as volume increases, the pressure on the molecules, because they can spread out more, decreases. Whereas on the picture on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that when volume decreases, pressure increases because we're squeezing the molecules together. Whenever we inhale, the diaphragm moves inferiorly. We create less pressure in our lungs. There's more pressure outside, so air moves passively inward. Pulmonary ventilation depends on 3 pressures. One is atmospheric, the other is intraalveolar, and the third is intrapleural. Atmospheric pressure is defined as the amount of force exerted by air on any surface. It's measured at sea level at 760 millimeters of mercury, or 1 atmosphere. If we have negative pressure, that would be less than atmospheric pressure. Positive pressure would be greater than atmospheric pressure. Intraalveolar pressure is the pressure within the alveoli, which varies during different stages of breathing. Intrapleural pressure is the pressure within the pleural cavity, and that's also variable. However, it's always lower than intraalveolar pressure and atmospheric pressure. That negative pressure in the pleural cavity is what helps hold the lungs in position and also keeps them from collapsing on the alveoli, because if there's too much pressure in the pleural cavity, that's going to squeeze on the alveoli. We've got these competing forces within the lungs and outside of the lungs that are trying to move the lungs in or out. And the elastic connective tissue within the lungs wants to pull them inward. Surface tension in the fluid in the lungs wants to pull them inward. However, the pleural fluid and the thoracic wall are keeping them outward. If we look at the term known as transpulmonary pressure, that's the difference between the intrapleural and the intraalveolar pressure. So the higher the transpulmonary pressure, the larger the lung becomes. So if the lungs lose elasticity, which is what happens with emphysema, then the lungs can become larger because they don't have that elastic connective tissue to pull them back inward. Conversely, if the intrapleural pressure becomes greater, if there's a puncture of that cavity, that can cause pressure from the outside to come in, and that would make the lungs smaller. They could collapse. As we take a look at other factors that can affect ventilation, breathing is dependent on contraction and relaxation of the diaphragm and thoracic muscles. The lungs are basically passive when this occurs, and thoracic recoil is what causes compression. The main non-elastic source to the flow of air is friction. That's what we refer to as resistance. Friction causes resistance, and that's the main non-elastic source to airflow. So the size of the airway is key. Flow is going to be based on the change of pressure over resistance, and the smaller the airway, the more resistance, because there's going to be more friction on the walls, and the larger the airway, the less resistance. Thoracic wall compliance, which is the ability of the thoracic wall to stretch while under pressure, is going to also play a role in this. Remember, air flows from high pressure to low pressure. Inspiration is the process that causes air to come into the lungs. Expiration is the process that causes air to leave the lungs. Sometimes inspiration is referred to as inhalation. Sometimes expiration is referred to as exhalation. The respiratory cycle is one inspiration followed by one expiration. When it comes to quiet breathing, which is normal breathing versus forced breathing, remember, air always flows from high to low pressure. Quiet breathing, or normal breathing, is known as eupnea, and the diaphragm and external intercostals will contract to increase the volume within the thoracic cavity. With forced breathing, which is hyperpnea, which could either be forced in or forced out, we have accessory muscles, which include the scalenes, pectoralis major and minor, sternocleidomastoid, the internal intercostals, the upper trapezius fibers, and the platysma can contract to expand or decrease the area within the thorax, even more so than normal. Respiratory volumes, or volumes of air that are moved or associated with the lungs, can be measured. Tidal volume is that amount of air, that volume of air that is moved during normal eupnea, quiet breathing. So the amount of air in and out is tidal volume. Expiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that can be forcefully exhaled after a normal exhale. So if I breathe in, breathe out, and then force air out, try to get as much out, that's expiratory reserve volume. It's the amount that can be forcefully exhaled. However, even as I exhale all that I can forcefully get out, there's still going to be a little left over in my lungs. And that's what we refer to as residual volume. It's the air remaining in the lungs after maximum forced exhalation. If I go back to tidal volume, breathe in, breathe out, and then come all the way in forcefully, as much as I can get in, that is what we refer to as inspiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be forcefully inhaled after a normal inspiration. Vital capacity is all the air that can be forcefully inhaled and then forcefully exhaled. So everything that anyone can force in and then out is vital capacity. There's always going to be that residual volume left that is not considered part of vital capacity. But vital capacity is everything forced in, forced out. Pulmonary function testing is usually done with a spirometer, and that machine is able to measure different types of volumes, such as forced vital capacity, forced expiratory volume, forced expiratory flow, and so on and so forth. There's another type of pulmonary function test called gas diffusion, which uses a blood gas analyzer, and that can measure arterial blood gases as well as the concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. Next, we're going to go to part 2 of 2 in the respiratory system.